Your water is scheduled for termination on the 1st of the month, Mr. Caldwell. The district received a formal complaint regarding gross negligence and resource wastage. The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick and unwelcome, like the scent of cheap perfume that always preceded her arrival. Karen Miller, president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association, stood on the edge of my perfectly manicured lawn, a thick sheaf of papers clutched in one hand and a clipboard in the other. She wielded that clipboard like a Roman legionary's shield, a flimsy piece of pressboard that she believed imbued her with unquestionable authority. She was a woman built like a filing cabinet, wide and dense, and her floral print muumuu did little to soften the hard, belligerent lines of her posture. A smug little smile played on her lips, the kind of smile a cat gives right before it pushes a glass off a table just to watch it shatter. For a moment I just stared at her, the hum of my workshop's air conditioner in the background the only sound. I had faced down insurgents in Fallujah, negotiated with warlords over billion-dollar infrastructure projects in hostile territory, and briefed 4-star generals with less ice in my veins than I felt right then. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of her threat was breathtaking. My water. She was coming after my water. It was a line that wasn't just crossed, it was obliterated. My home, my property, the small sanctuary I had built for myself and my family after a lifetime of service, was under direct assault from this petty tyrant in a flowery dress. If you've ever had a run-in with a power-tripping HOA board, a neighborhood dictator who gets a thrill from measuring your grass with a ruler, then hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you have your own HOA nightmare story, share it because we're all in this together. You are not going to want to miss how this one ends, because Karen Miller had just made the critical, catastrophic mistake of picking a fight over water with a man who happened to sit on the board of directors for the very same municipal water district she was complaining to. She thought she was laying a clever trap, but all she had done was march herself with a brass band and a floral print banner straight into the kill box I was about to design just for her. She had no idea who she was dealing with, and I was going to enjoy every single methodical, legally fortified moment of teaching her. The smile on her face was one of triumph, but I knew, with the cold certainty of a battle-tested strategist, that it was the last time she would ever feel so confident standing on my property again. The war had begun, not with a bang, but with a rustle of paperwork and the threat of a dry tap. And I was going to win it. My life in Oak Creek had been a deliberate choice, a calculated move towards peace and quiet after 25 years in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I retired as a lieutenant colonel, having spent my career designing and overseeing the construction of dams, aqueducts, and power grids in some of the most unforgiving places on Earth. I understood infrastructure. I understood regulations. And most importantly, I understood the intricate, often frustrating dance of bureaucracy. When my wife Sarah and I decided to settle down, we looked for a place with space. We found it here, a half-acre lot at the very edge of the development, backing up to a swath of undeveloped county land. It was perfect. I built my dream workshop, a place where I could tinker with old engines and build furniture. I installed a small greenhouse for Sarah's orchids. We planted a vegetable garden and a row of prize-winning rose bushes that were my singular vanity. Our life was ordered, calm, and blissfully free of the chaos I had known for so long. The HOA was at first just a minor annoyance, a booklet of rules we received at closing that seemed mostly reasonable. Keep your lawn tidy, don't paint your house purple, the usual stuff. For the first 2 years, we had almost no interaction with them. Then Karen Miller was elected HOA president. The first notice appeared in our mailbox about a month later. It was a crisp, professionally printed violation, complete with a color photograph. The offense, our trash receptacles were still visible from the street at 7:15 p.m. on collection day. The bylaws, it sternly reminded me, stipulated that all receptacles must be concealed by 6 p.m. The fine was $25. I paid it, Annoyed but unwilling to start a conflict over something so trivial, but it was the opening salvo. A week later, another notice. The trim on our house, a pleasant shade of eggshell white, was not one of the 3 pre-approved shades of beige listed in the architectural guidelines. We were given 30 days to repaint or face a daily fine. I repainted. Then came the war on gnomes. I had a small, cheerful garden gnome, a gift from my daughter, tucked away next to the rose bushes. It was barely visible from the street, but Karen's eagle eyes found it. A violation notice for unapproved lawn ornamentation arrived promptly. I moved the gnome to the backyard. Each time I complied. I documented the notice, took a photo of the remedy, and sent a polite formal email to the board confirming my compliance. I was building a file, a habit ingrained from my years in the military. You always document everything because you never know when you'll need the paper trail. My real entry into local politics came not from the HOA, but from an actual infrastructure failure. A major water main broke downtown, flooding a dozen businesses. The municipal water district's response was slow, disorganized, and poorly communicated. I watched their press conferences, read their reports, and saw a systemic failure of planning and crisis management. It offended my professional sensibilities. When a seat on the Water District's board of directors opened up, I decided to run. It was a volunteer position, unpaid, but I felt a civic duty to apply my expertise. My resume, with its decades of large-scale water project management, made me an easy choice. I was elected with 70% of the vote, and within 6 months my colleagues had voted me in as vice chairman. I enjoyed the work. We upgraded the emergency response protocols, secured grants for replacing aging pipelines, and improved public transparency. I felt I was contributing, making the community a better, safer place. I never imagined that this quiet, civic-minded role would become the ultimate weapon in a war over my own front yard. Karen Miller knew I was a retired colonel. It was in the little bio the HOA newsletter ran about new residents, but she clearly had no idea about my role with the water district. To her, I was just another nail to be hammered down, another resident to be bent to her will. Her fatal underestimation of me was a tactical error of the highest magnitude. The day she stood on my lawn, threatening my water supply, she wasn't just threatening a homeowner. She was threatening the vice chairman of the board that held her petition in its hands. She thought she was holding all the cards, but in reality, she had just handed me the entire deck. The official letter arrived 3 days after Karen's triumphant declaration on my lawn. It came in a crisp white envelope bearing the official seal of the Oak Creek Municipal Water District. My own seal. Seeing it in my mailbox, addressed to me as a defendant rather than a director, was a surreal moment. I carried it into my office, the same room where I often reviewed board meeting agendas and technical reports, and slid it open with a letter opener. The paper was thick, the letterhead formal. It was a standard notice of complaint and hearing, a form letter I had seen dozens of times from the other side of the table, but reading my own name and address listed under subject of complaint sent a jolt of cold, clarifying anger through me. The complainant was listed as expected, Karen Miller, in her capacity as president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. The body of the letter detailed her accusations, and they were a masterclass in malicious fiction. She alleged flagrant and ongoing violation of municipal drought ordinances, citing my lush, green lawn as evidence of gross resource wastage. She claimed I had made unauthorized modifications to my irrigation system, which had resulted in significant water runoff, creating a hazardous slick on public sidewalks and community pathways. Finally, she accused me of non-compliance with HOA directives regarding landscape water conservation, a charge she had completely invented, as no such official directive had ever been issued. It was a web of lies, spun from her own petty grievances and inflated with bureaucratic jargon to sound official and damning. I read it twice, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. She had done it. She had actually filed a formal official complaint, putting her name and her position on a document that was now a matter of public record. She had no idea of the gift she'd just given me. She thought she was using the system against me, but she was a novice playing checkers against a grandmaster. The system she was trying to weaponize was a system I helped oversee. I knew its rules, its procedures, and its vulnerabilities better than she could ever imagine. The process was simple. A complaint is filed, the district sends a notice to both parties, and a hearing is scheduled for the next public board meeting to adjudicate the matter. It was designed to be a fair and impartial process for resolving legitimate disputes, like a business owner contesting a bill or a resident reporting a genuine leak. It was not designed to be a tool for personal vendettas. Karen was counting on the intimidating power of an official government notice to make me panic, to make me cave. She envisioned me, a humble homeowner, trembling before the mighty HOA and the even mightier water district. She couldn't possibly have conceived of a reality where I would be sitting at the head table during her hearing, looking back at her from a position of authority. This letter wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. It was the formal beginning of hostilities, and it gave me everything I needed. I stood up and walked over to my filing cabinet. I pulled out the thick folder I had labeled HOA correspondence. Inside were copies of every violation notice, every email, every photograph documenting my meticulous compliance with her increasingly absurd demands. I took out a fresh yellow legal pad and a pen. At the top of the first page, I wrote in neat block letters, Operation Dry Well. This would not be an emotional battle. It would be a campaign executed with military precision. Phase 1 was complete. The enemy had revealed her position and her strategy. Phase 2 was about to begin. Intelligence gathering and the methodical assembly of an overwhelming counteroffensive. Karen Miller wanted to fight me over water. I was going to drown her in facts. The first step in any successful operation is reconnaissance. You don't fire a shot until you know the terrain, the enemy's strength, and their weaknesses. My campaign against Karen Miller would be no different. My office became a command center. I pinned a large map of the Oak Creek subdivision to a corkboard, marking my house and Karen's. I started a new, thicker binder, meticulously organized with dividers, photographic evidence, water usage data, HOA communications, legal precedent, and neighbor testimonials. This was a war of documentation, and my arsenal would be unassailable. I began with the accusations in her complaint, dismantling them one by one with cold, hard evidence. Her claim of gross resource wastage was the easiest to debunk. As a board member, I had access to the district's analytics portal. I logged in and pulled my water usage data for the past 36 months. The graphs were beautiful. They showed a clear pattern of responsible, below-average consumption. My property, at half an acre, was one of the larger lots, yet my usage was consistently 15% lower than the average for lots of a similar size. The reason was my high-efficiency, smart irrigation system, the very system she claimed was unauthorized. It used a combination of drip lines for the flower beds, low-flow sprinkler heads for the lawn, and a series of soil moisture sensors that communicated with a central weather station. The system didn't just run on a timer. It watered only when the ground was actually dry, and it knew not to run if rain was in the forecast. It was a model of water conservation. I printed the usage charts in full color, highlighting my numbers against the neighborhood average. Next, the unauthorized modifications. I went to the county records office and pulled the original permits for the installation of my irrigation system from 2 years prior. I had the schematics, the inspection report signed by a county official, and the certificate of completion. I made high-quality copies of everything. The system wasn't just authorized, it was professionally installed, inspected, and fully compliant with every county and state code. Then came the most audacious lie, the hazardous slick on public sidewalks. For this, I deployed modern technology. I had a few discrete, high-definition security cameras around my property for peace of mind. I repositioned one to give a clear, wide-angle view of the sidewalk in front of my house. I let it record for 3 days, capturing every sunrise, every dog walker, every passing car. I reviewed the footage each night. The sidewalk remained bone dry except for the 20 minutes immediately following the city's street sweeping, which, ironically, used more water than my lawn did in a week. I saved the time-stamped video files to a thumb drive, a digital alibi that would vaporize her claim. With my own defense solidified, I moved on to counterintelligence. It was time to examine the complainant herself. I took a walk, my phone in my pocket, and did a casual survey of Karen Miller's property. The hypocrisy was stunning. Her downspouts were not connected to a proper drainage system. They simply spewed water directly onto the public sidewalk, a clear violation of Municipal Code 12.4. Her sprinkler system was an ancient, inefficient model that misted more water into the air than it delivered to the grass. As I walked by, one of her sprinkler heads was visibly stuck, jetting a solid stream of water onto the street, creating the very hazardous slick she had accused me of. I discreetly took several photos and a short video, the sound of wasted water gurgling into a storm drain providing the perfect soundtrack. Her lawn had several brown, dying patches punctuated by one unnaturally green area near the leaky sprinkler head, a classic sign of a poorly maintained system. The final piece of my intelligence gathering phase was to understand the human terrain. I needed to know if I was her only target. My first stop was Dave Jensen, the retired Marine who lived across the street. He was a good man, disciplined and quiet. I found him in his garage polishing a piece of chrome from his vintage motorcycle. "Dave," I started, "got a minute? I wanted to ask you about your experiences with our esteemed HOA president." Dave put down his polishing cloth and let out a long, weary sigh. "Karen, let me guess. You got a letter?" For the next 20 minutes, he laid out a litany of petty harassments. He'd been fined for his flagpole being 2 inches too tall, for his son leaving a basketball on the driveway, and for oil stains on his garage floor that were only visible when the door was open. He fought the flagpole fine and won, but it cost him hours of his time preparing a defense for the board. Most of the time, he just paid to make her go away. "The woman's got nothing better to do than drive around looking for reasons to fine people," he concluded, his voice tight with frustration. "She gets off on the power." He wasn't the only one. I spoke with Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow down the street. Karen had hounded her for months about her bird feeders, claiming they attracted vermin and lowered property values. Mrs. Gable, intimidated and frightened of escalating fines, had finally taken them down. Her small joy, watching the finches and cardinals from her kitchen window, had been extinguished by Karen's bullying. I took careful notes of every conversation, asking each person if they would be willing to write a short statement about their experience. A pattern of abuse was emerging, a clear history of Karen using her position not to uphold community standards, but to harass and intimidate residents she personally disliked. My binder grew thicker, heavier. It was no longer just a defense of my property. It was becoming an indictment of a petty tyrant. Operation Dry Well was now about more than just my water. It was about restoring peace and fairness to the entire neighborhood. With a fortress of evidence built, it was time to move from defense to offense. A good commander knows you can't win a war by staying in your foxhole. You have to maneuver, to counterattack, to seize the initiative. My counterattack would be fought on 2 fronts, the Homeowners Association and the Water District. I would use Karen's own weapons, bureaucracy, and official procedure against her, but with a level of precision and strategic intent she couldn't possibly comprehend. My first move was to engage my old friend from the Army, Jim Riley. Jim had been a JAG officer, and now he ran a successful civil law practice downtown. I called him not to hire him, but for a strategic consultation. "Jim," I said, after we'd exchanged the usual pleasantries, "I'm in a bit of a dust-up with my HOA president. She's filed a malicious complaint with the Water District to try and get my water shut off." I heard him chuckle on the other end of the line. "Let me guess, Muskelae," he said. "Her name is Karen." I spent 30 minutes laying out the situation, Karen's harassment, the complaint, the evidence I had gathered. So here's my question, I concluded. I'm not looking to file a lawsuit right now. I want to handle this through the established channels first, but I want to know the precise legal framework. What is the personal liability for an HOA board member who knowingly files a false report with a government agency? What constitutes a pattern of harassment under state law? Jim gave me exactly what I needed. He cited specific state statutes regarding frivolous litigation and the fiduciary duty of HOA board members. He explained that while the corporate shield of the HOA offered some protection, a board member acting in provable bad faith outside the scope of their duties could be held personally liable for damages. This was crucial. It meant I could credibly threaten to go after not just the HOA's insurance policy, but Karen's personal assets. He emailed me the relevant case law and statutes, which I promptly printed and added to my binder. Armed with this legal foundation, I drafted my first official counteroffensive, a formal complaint to the HOA Board of Directors. I did not address it to Karen. Instead, I addressed it to the board's secretary, a quiet woman named Brenda, who I suspected was no fan of Karen's leadership style. I sent it via certified mail with a return receipt requested, ensuring it would be officially logged. The letter was 12 pages long. It was calm, professional, and devastating. I began by stating that I was formally requesting an investigation into the conduct of President Karen Miller for abuse of power and targeted harassment. I methodically detailed the history of her frivolous violation notices against me. Then I attached a copy of the complaint she had filed with the Water District, followed by a summary of the evidence I had gathered proving it was demonstrably false. I cited the state statutes Jim had given me. Subtly noting the potential for personal liability, I concluded by demanding the board formally censure the president for her actions, retract the complaint with the Water District, and issue a formal apology. I knew they wouldn't do it, not with Karen in charge. But the letter wasn't designed to achieve that. It was designed to put the entire board on legal notice. It created a paper trail showing that I had tried to resolve the issue internally. When they inevitably ignored or dismissed my complaint, it would strengthen my future legal position by demonstrating their own negligence. My second offensive was aimed at the Water District itself. This was a more delicate maneuver. I couldn't be seen as using my position as vice chairman to influence the outcome of my own case. Everything had to be done officially, transparently, and by the book. I scheduled a meeting with the district's general manager, a career civil servant named Robert. In the meeting, I was careful to frame my request not as a personal matter, but as a matter of board oversight and policy. Robert, I began, I'm formally recusing myself from all matters related to the complaint filed against my property. However, this incident has brought a potential issue to my attention that I believe the board needs to examine from a policy perspective. I explained that an HOA was attempting to use the district's complaint process as a tool for leverage in a private dispute. I am concerned, I said, that this may not be an isolated incident. I believe it is part of our fiduciary duty to understand the scope of this problem. I then made a formal request as a board member for a staff report detailing all water service termination requests that had originated from any HOA within our service area over the past 5 years. I wanted to see the number of complaints, the reasons cited, and the ultimate disposition of each case. This was my pincer move. On one hand, I was forcing the HOA board to confront Karen's behavior internally. On the other, I was initiating an official, district-wide investigation into the very tactic she was using against me. This would trigger alarms with the district's legal counsel. They would see the potential liability for the district if it were found to be complicit in an HOA's harassment campaign. It would put Karen's complaint under a microscope, not just as a single case, but as a potential example of a systemic problem. Robert, a stickler for procedure, saw the logic in my request. A formal inquiry was launched. The gears of the bureaucracy were now turning, slowly but unstoppably, in the direction I had set. Karen thought she was playing a simple game of chess. She didn't realize I was playing on a 3-dimensional board, and her king was already in check. The day of the Water District Board meeting arrived, cloaked in the gray, overcast light of a late autumn afternoon. I chose my attire with care, a simple, dark blue suit, a crisp white shirt, and a conservative tie. It was the uniform of a public servant, projecting calm authority and seriousness. I arrived early, taking my customary seat at the large U-shaped dais with the other 4 board members. My nameplate, Mark Caldwell, Vice Chairman, was polished and centered in front of me. I arranged my files, my binder for Operation Dry Well placed discreetly in my briefcase at my feet, while a simple folder with the meeting's agenda lay on the table before me. The boardroom was a sterile, functional space. Beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and rows of uncomfortable chairs for the public. Slowly, the room began to fill. Robert, the general manager, took his seat. The district's lawyer settled in at a side table. Then I saw her. Karen Miller made her entrance not with a whisper but with the force of a minor weather system. She was dressed in a vibrant canary yellow pantsuit that was impossible to ignore. Trailing in her wake was a mousy-looking man I recognized as one of her more sycophantic neighbors, clearly there to serve as her witness. She surveyed the room, her eyes scanning the public seating area, presumably looking for me. When she didn't see me there, a flicker of smug satisfaction crossed her face. She probably assumed I was too intimidated to show up. She took a seat in the front row, arranged her own pile of papers on her lap, and sat with the posture of a queen holding court. She had no idea. The meeting was called to order by our chairman, George Peterson, a retired accountant with a no-nonsense demeanor. They moved through the opening agenda items with practiced efficiency: approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a report from the Finance Committee, an update on the pipeline replacement project. My heart rate remained steady, a calm rhythm I had learned to maintain under pressure. Finally, George looked down at his agenda. Next item, he announced, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room, is Public Hearing 7A, a complaint filed by Karen Miller of the Oak Creek HOA regarding water usage at the property of 124 Willow Lane. He looked up at the audience. Mrs. Miller, you have the floor. Please state your name for the record, and then you will have 10 minutes to present your case. Karen stood, walked to the public lectern, and beamed at the board. Good afternoon, esteemed members of the board, she began, her voice oozing a false deference that set my teeth on edge. My name is Karen Miller, and I'm the president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association. I am here today not as a private citizen, but as a representative of a community deeply concerned about the responsible use of our shared, precious water resources. For the next 10 minutes, she performed. She spoke of community standards, shared sacrifice, and the importance of setting an example during the dry season. She painted a picture of a rogue homeowner, myself, who flagrantly disregarded his neighbors and wasted water with impunity. She held up a blurry, out-of-focus photograph of a damp patch of concrete. This, she declared dramatically, is the hazardous condition created daily by the runoff from Mr. Caldwell's property. It is a danger to our children, a blight on our community. She concluded with a flourish. We are simply asking the district to enforce its own rules and hold this homeowner accountable. We ask that you approve our petition to terminate service until these serious issues are rectified. She gathered her papers, gave the board another syrupy smile, and returned to her seat, looking immensely pleased with herself. George Peterson listened patiently, his face impassive. When she was finished, he made a few notes, then looked up. Thank you, Mrs. Miller. He then scanned the dais. The board will now hear from the homeowner in question. He paused, letting the moment hang in the air, and then turned his head directly towards me. Vice Chairman Caldwell, he said, his voice perfectly neutral. You have the floor. It was a moment of pure, delicious cinematic gold. Every head in the room swiveled towards me. I saw Karen's eyes go wide, her jaw slackening in disbelief. The canary yellow of her pantsuit seemed to pale. Her smug smile dissolved, replaced by a mask of utter confusion and dawning horror. Her witness looked back and forth between us, as if trying to solve a complex math problem in his head. I rose slowly from my seat at the head table. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Bearers, I said, my voice calm and steady. For the record, I will, of course, be recusing myself from any discussion or vote on this particular matter. I walked from the dais to the public lectern, the same one she had just used. I placed my simple folder on it and looked directly at Karen. Her face was a mixture of shock and rage. However, I continued, addressing the board, I would like to address the complaint as the homeowner of 124 Willow Lane. I nodded to Robert, who dimmed the lights and turned on the overhead projector. My first slide appeared on the large screen behind me. It was a high-resolution satellite image of the neighborhood with my property and Karen's property circled in red. The complaint alleges gross negligence and resource wastage, I began. Let's examine the facts. For the next 15 minutes, I systematically and without emotion dismantled her entire case. I showed the color-coded graphs of my water usage, proving I was more efficient than the neighborhood average. I displayed the county-approved permits and inspection certificates for my unauthorized irrigation system. I played the time-stamped security footage showing a bone-dry sidewalk for 3 consecutive days. Then I put up the photos I had taken of her own property. The gushing sprinkler head, the downspout draining directly onto the sidewalk. The hazardous slick Mrs. Miller described, I stated calmly, is more likely originating from her own property, a clear violation of Municipal Code 12.4. I concluded by turning off the projector and looking at the board. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, this complaint has absolutely nothing to do with water conservation. It is a frivolous and malicious action born from a personal vendetta by an HOA president who is abusing her position. It represents a profound waste of this board's valuable time, a waste of taxpayer money, and an abuse of the public hearing process. I gathered my folder and returned to my seat on the dais, leaving a stunned silence in my wake. Karen sat frozen in her chair, her face ashen. The trap had been sprung. The hunter was now the prey. The silence in the boardroom stretched for a long, uncomfortable moment. All eyes were on Chairman George Peterson. He adjusted his glasses, looked down at the pile of documents Karen had submitted, then at the file I had presented, and then back at Karen. His expression was one of severe disappointment, like a teacher who had just caught his prize student cheating on a final exam. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "does the complainant have any response to the evidence presented by the homeowner?" Karen sputtered, half rising from her seat. This is an ambush. He's using his position. It's a conflict of interest." George held up a hand, cutting her off. Mr. Caldwell correctly recused himself from this matter. He addressed the board as a private citizen, from the public lectern, which is his right. The evidence he presented consists of official district records, county permits, and photographic documentation. Do you have any evidence to refute it? Her face, which had been pale with shock, now flushed a deep, mottled red of pure rage. She had nothing. Her entire case had been built on bluster and lies, and it had just been publicly and methodically incinerated. She sank back into her chair, speechless. George turned to the other 3 board members. "I believe we have all the information we need. I will entertain a motion." A board member to my left, a sharp woman named Eleanor, spoke up immediately. "Mr. Chairman, I move that we dismiss complaint 7A with prejudice on the grounds that it is frivolous, without merit, and not supported by any credible evidence." "Second," another member chimed in. "All in favor?" George asked. 4 hands, everyone but mine, shot into the air. "The motion carries unanimously. The complaint is dismissed." But George wasn't finished. He looked directly at Karen, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority as chairman. "Mrs. Miller, this board does not take kindly to its processes being used to settle personal scores. You have wasted the time of district staff, legal counsel, and this board. You have filed a complaint that was not just unsubstantiated but demonstrably false. I would strongly advise you to reconsider ever bringing such a matter before us again." It was a public and complete rebuke. The words would be entered into the official meeting minutes, a permanent public record of her humiliation. Karen grabbed her papers, her hands trembling with fury, and stormed out of the boardroom without another word, her canary yellow pantsuit a blur of defeated rage. Her witness scurried out behind her like a frightened field mouse. The meeting concluded a few minutes later. As we packed up, George came over and clapped me on the shoulder. "Well, Mark," he said with a wry smile, "that was the most interesting hearing on a water bill I've seen in my 12 years on this board. You handled that perfectly." I just nodded. "I appreciate the board's professionalism, George." The battle was won, but I knew the war wasn't over. A creature like Karen Miller doesn't learn from defeat. She festers. Humiliation would not lead to introspection. It would curdle into a thirst for revenge. I was right. The story of the water board meeting spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The official minutes were posted on the district website, and someone quickly shared the link on the community Facebook page. The tale of Karen's public takedown became the stuff of local legend. For a few days there was a blessed, beautiful silence from the HOA. I almost allowed myself to believe she might have learned her lesson. Then the letter arrived. It was another official HOA violation notice, slid unceremoniously through my mail slot. This time the fine was for $500. The violation? Unauthorized landscaping alteration. I stared at the notice, baffled. I hadn't altered anything. Then I read the fine print, which included a grainy photo of my front flower bed. The unauthorized alteration, it turned out, was the 3 new rose bushes I had planted 2 weeks earlier. The bushes were in a pre-existing, pre-approved flower bed. They violated no rule, no bylaw, no covenant. The violation was a complete and utter fabrication. It was a desperate, transparently retaliatory act. It was the flailing of a wounded animal, lashing out in a blind rage. And it was the single biggest mistake she could have possibly made. Her previous actions had been harassment, but they were cloaked in the guise of enforcing rules, however petty. This was different. This was a direct, provable act of retaliation for me exercising my right to defend myself in a public forum. She had just handed me the smoking gun I needed to end her reign for good. The first battle was a defensive victory. This new attack would allow me to launch the final, decisive offensive that would remove her from power permanently. She had escalated, and in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. Karen's retaliatory fine was the spark that ignited the prairie fire. Her public humiliation at the water board meeting had made her a laughingstock, but this new blatant act of revenge made her a threat that the neighborhood could no longer ignore. It was one thing to be a petty tyrant, enforcing absurd rules. It was another entirely to be a vindictive bully using the HOA's power to punish someone for standing up to her. This was no longer just my fight, it was everyone's. The first person at my door was Dave Jensen, the Marine from across the street. He was holding a copy of the violation notice for my rose bushes, which someone had posted in the Facebook group. His face was set in a hard, determined line. "This is it, Mark," he said, his voice a low growl. "This is the hill we die on. What's the plan?" That evening, my 2-car garage, usually filled with the smell of sawdust and motor oil, was packed with 25 of my neighbors. They were angry, frustrated, and finally ready to fight back. I stood before them not as a colonel, but as a neighbor. I had my Operation Dry Well binder on a workbench, open for all to see. "Karen Miller has overplayed her hand," I began, my voice calm and measured. "She has demonstrated a pattern of harassment, abuse of power, and now direct retaliation. We have tolerated her for too long, hoping she would just be a temporary annoyance, but her behavior is escalating and it will not stop until we stop her." I laid out the strategy, using the military planning skills that had been drilled into me for decades. This would not be a chaotic mob. It would be an organized, disciplined insurgency. First, we needed to consolidate our forces. We went through the HOA's official roster, identifying every homeowner. We created a phone tree and an email list, ensuring we could communicate quickly and efficiently. We designated block captains to go door to door, speaking with residents who weren't active online. Our goal was to build a supermajority, a coalition so large it could not be ignored. Second, we needed to arm ourselves with information. We dissected the HOA bylaws, the thick, tedious document Karen had always used as her weapon. We highlighted the sections on board member responsibilities, ethics, and, most importantly, the procedures for calling a special meeting and initiating a recall vote. We discovered that a petition signed by just 20% of homeowners was enough to force a special meeting. We would aim for 50%. Third, we would gather our ammunition. I asked everyone who had ever received what they felt was an unfair violation notice from Karen to write a formal signed statement detailing their experience. Mrs. Gable, the widow who had been forced to remove her bird feeders, wrote a heartbreakingly simple, powerful account. Dave Jensen detailed his fight over the flagpole. A young couple told the story of being fined because their toddler's plastic slide was visible over their back fence. Within a week, we had over 40 signed statements, a mountain of evidence detailing years of petty tyranny. The petition to recall Karen Miller as HOA president circulated through the neighborhood. It was more than just a petition. It was a declaration of independence. We achieved our 50% signature threshold in just 3 days. We formally submitted the petition to the board secretary, Brenda, legally compelling her to schedule a special meeting within 30 days. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The HOA meeting, held in the community clubhouse. It was Karen's home turf, the place where she had ruled with an iron fist for 2 years, but this time it would be different. The room was packed to overflowing, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The energy was electric, a palpable mixture of anger and hope. Karen and the 2 other board members, her loyal cronies, sat at a folding table at the front of the room looking visibly shaken by the sheer number of people who had turned out. Karen tried to control the proceedings, starting the meeting with a long, rambling speech about her accomplishments as president. But Dave Jensen was prepared. He stood up, waited for a pause, and made a formal motion based on Robert's Rules of Order. I moved to suspend the current agenda and proceed immediately to the business for which this special meeting was called, the recall of President Karen Miller. Someone else seconded the motion instantly. A voice vote was called, and a thunderous "Aye" shook the room. The motion passed. Karen's face was a thundercloud of fury. She had lost control of her own meeting. One by one, residents we had designated beforehand stood up to speak. They didn't yell or insult. They simply read their signed statements into the record. Mrs. Gable's voice trembled as she spoke about her bird feeders, but she stood her ground, and when she finished, the room gave her a standing ovation. Dave spoke about the flagpole, framing it as an issue of patriotism and respect. A dozen other stories were told, each one a small cut, bleeding Karen's authority away drop by drop. Finally, it was my turn. I walked to the front, my binder in hand. I didn't speak about my rose bushes or my water. I spoke about the law. I explained the concept of fiduciary duty, the legal obligation of a board member to act in the best interest of the entire community, not to pursue personal vendettas. I presented the public record from the Water District meeting as evidence of her malicious and untruthful conduct. This is not about grass height or the color of our mailboxes, I concluded, my voice ringing with clarity. This is about the abuse of power. It's about restoring fairness and decency to our community. It is time to hold President Miller accountable. The vote was a mere formality. When the motion to recall Karen Miller from the office of HOA president was called, the result was a deafening, unanimous sea of raised hands. It was a complete and total repudiation of her reign. She was stripped of her power publicly and decisively by the very people she had sought to control. The immediate aftermath of the recall vote was a moment of profound and cathartic release. The tension that had gripped the clubhouse evaporated, replaced by applause and cheers. Karen Miller, stripped of her title and her authority, sat stunned for a moment before gathering her things and slinking out a side door, not as a president, but as a pariah. She didn't make eye contact with anyone. Her reign of terror was officially over. In the same meeting, following the proper procedure we had all studied, Dave Jensen was nominated and elected as the new HOA president. His first official act was to propose a motion. "I move," he announced, his voice steady and strong, "that this board immediately and retroactively voids all fines and violations issued in the past 12 months that are currently under appeal or unpaid, and that we issue a formal apology to the residents who were targeted." The motion passed unanimously to another round of applause. My $500 fine for the crime of planting roses vanished into thin air, along with dozens of other petty penalties that had been plaguing my neighbors, but our work wasn't finished. The new board, with Dave at the helm and 2 other reasonable community-minded residents elected alongside him, made another motion: to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA's finances during Karen's tenure. They had a fiduciary duty to ensure the community's funds had been managed properly. This was the final, critical piece of the puzzle. I had suspected for a while that Karen's obsession with fining people was about more than just a power trip. The audit results, delivered 3 months later, confirmed my suspicions in spectacular fashion. It turned out that the HOA's exclusive landscaping contractor, a company called Prestige Garden Solutions, that charged exorbitant rates for basic services like mowing and pruning, was owned and operated by Karen Miller's brother-in-law. Furthermore, the auditor found a consistent pattern of consulting fees paid out to a company that listed Karen's home address as its place of business. She had been using the HOA's bank account as her personal slush fund, siphoning off thousands of dollars in dues and fine revenues. The audit was turned over to the local police department. An official investigation was launched, and 6 months after she was voted out of office, Karen Miller was charged with felony embezzlement and fraud. Her legal battle ended not with a bang, but with a quiet plea bargain that involved a hefty restitution payment, 5 years of probation, and a court order permanently barring her from ever serving on any board of directors again. Her house went up for sale shortly thereafter. The day the moving truck pulled away, a palpable sense of peace settled over the neighborhood. The changes under Dave's leadership were immediate and profound. The focus shifted from punitive enforcement to community building. They organized a neighborhood barbecue, a Halloween parade for the kids, and a volunteer day to help elderly residents with their yard work. The HOA newsletter, once a source of dread filled with warnings and threats, was now filled with pictures of smiling neighbors and announcements for fun events. My life returned to the quiet rhythm I had always wanted. My workshop was once again my sanctuary. Sarah's orchids thrived in her greenhouse. My prize-winning roses, the ones that had triggered the final battle, bloomed with a particular brilliance that spring, their crimson petals a small, beautiful symbol of our victory. One quiet Saturday morning, I was out in my front yard tending to my garden. The smart sprinkler system, the one that had been at the center of the initial conflict, kicked on with a soft hiss, casting a gentle, arching mist over the lawn. The water flowed freely, reliably, a right I had fought for and won. I looked up and saw Mrs. Gable across the street. She was standing on a small step stool, happily hanging a brand new, brightly colored bird feeder from a branch of her oak tree. She caught my eye, and a wide, genuine smile spread across her face. She gave me a little wave. I nodded back, a quiet acknowledgement shared between 2 neighbors who had seen a small injustice and refused to let it stand. I had learned long ago in my career that the most important battles are not always the largest ones. Sometimes the fight for a flagpole, for a bird feeder, or for the right to plant a rose bush in your own yard is a fight for something much bigger. It's a fight for the simple, fundamental principle that power should be wielded with responsibility, not with malice. It's a testament to the fact that when good people decide they have had enough and stand together, no petty tyrant can withstand them. The water was flowing, the birds were returning, and our community was finally at peace, and that was a victory sweeter than any I had ever known.